Welcome back, and what we're going to do now is pick up from chapter number 5 of the class notes, continuing with our trawl through corporate governance individual areas and looking at shareholder relationships. Now, it's important to understand that this is a two-sided issue. Let's remember that what we want is the board of directors to run the company in the best interests of the shareholders. And that means being held accountable to those shareholders, which means providing transparent information about what the board have been doing so the shareholders can judge how well the company is being run. Now that puts a lot of the onus, the burden on the directors to give the shareholders what they need and what they want. But we should also appreciate that if we want this communication to work, communication is a two-way thing. And it's not just getting the directors to provide what the shareholders might want, it's getting the shareholders to instigate communication with the directors as well as and when necessary. That means that communication is likely to fall into two types. The regular normal stuff that will always happen, and the extras that will only happen in certain circumstances. Whoops, apologies. So we need to make sure that shareholders and potentially some other stakeholders as well are provided with, as it says in bold up there, a balanced and understandable assessment of the company's position and prospects. That does not just mean the annual report and the financial statements, because that's once a year. It's going to need to be more and more regular than that. In terms of the annual report, what sort of stuff does it have in there? Well, annual reports virtually always begin with the chairman, the person on the board who is the sort of shareholder representative, if you like, giving their view to the shareholders of how the company is performing. That's likely to be quite overview and focus on one or two key issues. A more detailed operational report then comes from the chief executive who's been running the company. There may be other sections on more detailed, several pages of business review on the different aspects of what the company does. Then, of course, we get the financial statements which have been audited. And then we get the most important section for this course, the governance section. So let me give you some bit more detail than is provided in the notes on this, I think would be wise. And it's not difficult to remember what goes into this. Just remember what are the sections of corporate governance, because for all of the sections, we are going to need some disclosures. Excuse me. So what are the sections? Effective board of directors, the directors themselves individually, the committees, board evaluation of performance. Then we've got directors' pay stuff, internal controls, risk management, etc. So your typical disclosures are going to be regarding the board, its structure, names and biographies of the directors, including what other board roles they currently hold or have held in the past. That will help the shareholders to be able to assess the skills and experience of the board and any potential conflicts of interest with other roles they currently hold. There will be information about board meetings and committee meetings and the attendance rate of each member of the board or the committees, so that shareholders can see if directors are fulfilling their duties and actually simply turning up. And there will be a clear accountability detailing what the board does and what each committee does. Talking of committees, there will be a report from each of the committees that the company has. They may have many committees, not just the ones that are required by corporate governance. Good corporate governance is partly about risk. There will therefore be an analysis of this company's business risks and how the company is managing them. Internal controls is an important part of governance. And there will need to be an explanation, yes, of the evaluation process that was carried out and the conclusions that it came to. So those are your typical sections of a corporate governance report. Basically what it's doing is going through the whole of the UK code point by point to comment on how the company has achieved all the things in there. There are lots more I could say, but that gives you a little flavour, a little splattering of what's included. It then says mandatory versus voluntary. Now, a lot of things that companies disclose, they have no choice over. That's mandatory. Excuse me for a second. But sometimes a company might choose to disclose additional stuff. Which raises an interesting question. Why on earth would a company give information that they don't have to give? Well, lots of potential reasons for this. The board might wish to appear totally transparent. So even though we're not required to tell you this, our view is we're going to tell you everything we think you might want to know. It might be a strategy of disclosing more than your competitors to look like you care more about the people reading the annual report. Or maybe hoping your competitors will be forced into disclosing the same information so you can find out what it is. Or maybe everybody else discloses it voluntarily, so you feel if everybody else does, you've really got no choice. But there might also be some tactics in here. If the government makes it mandatory, the government will also tell you exactly what to disclose and how to do it. If you disclose something voluntarily, it means you control how the information is disclosed. So if you want to avoid laws telling you to do something, it's sometimes best to do it yourself voluntarily, because then you keep control of it. It could be damage limitation. You've just been in the newspapers, big scandal, it's not looking good. If you are now viewed as holding back information, it will just get worse. So maybe it's time to accept that your reputation is as bad as it's going to be and just flop all the information on the table while you've got the chance. Get it all out there. Now, everything I've written there all looks a little bit like a company that's trying to save itself rather than help the shareholders. We should add on to the list that you might disclose something because you genuinely feel it helps the shareholders understand the company. Now, in the second half of this course, we will be heading into a lot of ethics and social responsibility and stuff like that, and trying to understand why companies do what they do. A general theme that's going to come out of that is companies generally seem to do things for one of two reasons. Because they genuinely care about their shareholders and stakeholders, or they care about themselves. Most of what I've written up on the screen there is a company trying to protect itself. But we should bear in mind that there are some genuinely ethical people in the business world who genuinely want to give people the information they need. Okay. So there's a bit of mandatory versus voluntary. Shareholder dialogue. Now, a lot of this is the normal stuff that will happen all of the time. So things like the annual general meeting, an EGM, an extraordinary general meeting, when you've got something important. That you need to talk to the shareholders about, that can't wait for the next AGM. The annual report is communication with shareholders, but those annual report, AGM, annual general meeting are annual, and that is not enough. We need more regular stuff. Listed companies will have a preliminary results announcement before the full accounts. They will also have quarterly results announcements, and those all present opportunities to discuss those issues with shareholders. You probably won't hold a general meeting at that point. It's unlikely people want to turn up to one 4 times a year. But you can, thanks to the joys of technology, have podcasts, conference calls, what would allow shareholders to dial in and listen to what the board have to say and potentially ask questions as well. Just one little point from the bottom of that list. If you are a shareholder and you want to talk to someone at the company you've invested in about something to do with your investment or corporate governance, Companies will have an investor relations department who will deal with you. And if you wanted to get in contact with the company's chairman or someone like that, you go through investor relations. Annual general meeting, very administrative exercise really, but to make sure there is accountability, all directors should attend and be willing to answer questions. At the AGM, the director's job is to be held accountable, but also to get the views of the shareholders. It's possibly the only time in the year that you're going to see all of them, or at least a large number of them, face to face. And a well-run AGM can potentially persuade shareholders to invest more money in the future. So it's in your interest to do it well. For shareholders, it's a chance to vote directors on or off the board, auditors in or out, approve formally the annual financial statements, and question the board on any issues that you wish to question them on, with the benefit that you can ask these questions in front of other shareholders, meaning you can advertise your concerns and hopefully, from your perspective, gather some support from the other shareholders who might share your views. I think we've covered proxy voting already, but just to remind you, proxy voting is largely there for people who cannot attend the AGM and allows you to cast your vote by passing your vote to somebody else. So, for example, this would allow you to nominate a friend or colleague who could attend the AGM for you. That's very helpful because it means that you can have questions asked on your behalf by your friend or colleague, rather than simply just voting by post or via the website before the day of the AGM. So it allows you to still sort of have an involvement in the AGM, even if you cannot attend. Now, I've said at the start of this chapter that if you want good communication, it's not just about the directors communicating with the shareholders. Maybe the shareholders need to be a bit more proactive as well. So why might shareholders want to do this? Why should shareholders do this? And what shareholders are we talking about here? Well, primarily we're talking here about the institutional ones. As we have noticed, institutional shareholders tend to hold the bigger stakes in companies, which means they have more voting power, which means they're better able to get the board to listen. And institutional investors are organisations in their own right with a lot of specialist knowledge and experience. And for all of those reasons, we think that maybe they have a bit of a responsibility to jump in and question the board when the board are not doing a particularly good job. So when should they intervene? Well, they should intervene when they have concerns over something that's going on at the company. Those concerns could be that the company is doing things which look a bit odd without justifying them completely. It could be as simple as poor company performance. As we're seeing at the moment, it could be executive pay looks too high. As from the beginning of the class this evening, could be concerns about risk management. It could be that recently there have been repeated control failures. Could be illegal, unethical activities at the company. Or it could simply be that usual board communication has stopped, or the people on the board who are meant to represent you shareholders, you've lost confidence in. So there are all sorts of reasons that you might want to march along to a company or phone them up or email them and say, look, we need to talk about this because we are no longer happy with how the board are running the company. Now this is of course in the notes coming up, but it's the sort of list where I think the best way of you getting good at it is to think about it. Don't memorize it, get a piece of paper and ask yourself, why might you complain to LSBF? Why might you complain at work to your boss? What sort of things would prompt that? Because it's a fairly similar answer, to be frank. And that is what the notes go on to talk about. Now, intervening can have its good points and its bad points. If you intervene, you make it clear to the directors that you expect communication to happen, and that may well prompt them to be more communicative in the future. On the other hand, if you intervene and complain about what they're doing, they might decide they don't want to talk to you much in the future. It might stop future communication. So you've got to be a bit careful about this and try to make sure you get the balance right. You want a strong relationship with the board of directors, so you can always ask them things and contact them. So if you're constantly complaining, you are putting that relationship at risk. As we noted earlier in the course, in fact, we'll take this onto a separate page. The UK Corporate Governance Code is aimed at directors' behaviour. But if we want good corporate governance, as I've been trying to point out in the last few minutes, we want shareholders, and in particular the bigger, longer-term shareholders, the institutional ones, to play a part and have some responsibilities as well. There is therefore a UK Stewardship Code. Which looks at things like, do they attend AGMs? What are their policies on voting? When do they decide to vote against companies? Do they have trigger points? Or do they go on a more sort of touchy-feely basis? Do they liaise with other insurance companies' pension funds? Do they play a part in the Association of British Insurers, the National Association of Pension Funds? So do they talk to other similar institutions? And things like that. And these institutional investors, rather like companies, are expected to disclose how they meet the terms of the Stewardship Code. And just to give them some incentive to do this well, the Financial Reporting Council, who manage all of this stuff, rate institutional investors from Tier 1, which is excellent, to Tier 3, which is disappointing, on the quality of their disclosures and reports about following that Stewardship Code. So the institutional investors are being judged and held to account. So that if you are thinking of investing in an insurance company or a pension fund, you can actually go and see how well they are rated in terms of their own governance. All interesting stuff. And would you believe it? Suddenly the chapters are flying by. Which means we move on to the last of the corporate governance chapters. It's titled Global Governance, which would imply that we're about to look at different corporate governance around the world. And we are. But that's not the only angle to what's going on in this chapter. And maybe a better title for the chapter would be not to purely focus on the word global, but to look at different types of governance from different angles. For example, we are going to look at principles-based corporate governance versus a rules or law-based approach, which is basically the UK versus the US of A. In this chapter, we are also going to look at private sector governance, which is the listed companies that we've been working on so far, and compare that with the public sector, so state-run enterprises like government departments, the police force, quite a lot of the health service, the education service, the army. And we'll also look at what is often referred to as the third sector, for example, charities, and look at the different governance issues in those different types of organisation. We will also look at insider approaches to governance versus outsider. In particular, looking at one type of insider approach, which is family companies. And since the title of the chapter does suggest we're going to do it, we will also look at a bit of global. So we'll take a look at how the Sarbanes-Oxley Act in America is different to UK governance. And we'll also look at maybe one or two other countries as well, just so you can see the variety that is out there. Okay, let's get moving then. Principles versus rules-based. Now this is a question which does not just apply to corporate governance. We could also look at principles versus rules-based ethics, for example, and we will do much later in the course. Some countries have their corporate governance mostly in law, like America. Some countries, like the UK, mostly have what appears to be a voluntary code. So what are the pros and cons of each? Now obviously the advantages of one will be the disadvantages of the other, so let's just have all the advantages and then we've covered ourselves. Well, a law or rules-based system has one big advantage, that you can punish those who break. And one of the reasons that you can do that is laws or rules are always very specific and clear. Which also means that having a rules-based system means that all companies have to follow the same procedures, which is simple and consistent for investors who may be investing in multiple companies. Oh, that all sounds pretty good. What about principles-based? The problem with having very specific rules is it's quite easy to work out a way around them. Every rule has loopholes. Principles can't have loopholes because they're too vague. Have an effective board. Well, there's no way around that. You have to have an effective board. If it was rules-based, it would have to tell you exactly what to do to have an effective board. But the principle is very basic. And because it is basic, it can be flexibly applied to different company situations. Because even if your governance is only going to be applied to the biggest listed companies, they're not all the same. Having the ability to tailor what you want to achieve to each individual company using this stuff is surely a very powerful thing. So there are some pros with each of the two approaches. I suppose one danger with the principles-based, turning the law-based advantage on its head, is for principles, how can you enforce people following something that's so vague? Yeah, good point. That's going to be difficult. And that's where the UK has come up with a rather sensible approach, which a lot of countries have copied. The approach is coming up in the notes and is called Comply or Explain. If you are a listed company in the UK, you must follow the stock exchange's rules. And the stock exchange rule is you are expected to follow the UK Corporate Governance Code, but you are allowed to not follow any of it that you wish, including all of it, as long as you explain this non-compliance in your annual report. Some companies have tried to deliberately not follow bits of the code, and then they've explained themselves in their annual report, and in virtually every situation the shareholders have not been happy about it and have said, we don't like your reasoning, follow the code. Most companies have therefore realised that whilst the code is not compulsory, because you've got to disclose if you haven't followed it, it's probably easier all around to just follow it. And then you don't have to give any excuses, reasons, or justification. Let's now move on and look at a bit of global governance and look at Sarbanes-Oxley. And specifically, in what ways is it different to the UK's corporate governance? Well, obviously one way it's different is it's law, not principles. And as a result, non-compliance can lead to jail terms for directors. That's a bit of an incentive to follow it, isn't it? It's worth remembering that the Sarbanes-Oxley Act was prompted largely by Enron in 2001. And the two biggest issues that came out of the Enron collapse were the role of the auditors and the role of the non-executive directors. The result is the Sarbanes-Oxley Act covers those in quite a bit of detail. With Enron, one of the concerns is that the auditors, Arthur Andersen, or Andersons as they were known at that stage, were swayed into being too nice to the client and hiding what was going on in the accounts because of the massive fees they were earning from the other services they were selling. As a result, the Sarbanes-Oxley Act bans most other services being sold to audit clients. It also levelled up the US with a lot of things already happening in the UK. So things like audit partner rotation, something that had already been in place in the UK, was instigated in the States as a result of this too. To try to tighten things up going forward, more defined roles for non-executives and committees, especially the Audit Committee. And loans to directors from companies banned. If you think about it, if you wanted to borrow money from your employer, you'd have to talk to them and get them to say yes. If you're a director, you talk to yourself because you are the company. So it would be too easy to lend yourself lots of money, which you might then struggle to pay back. So they are banned. But probably the most important issue for the exam is this. American listed companies are required to have an annual evaluation of their control systems. Well, that's fine. That's the same as the UK. But the big difference here is you don't just report the results, you get your auditor to audit them. And that is not the same as the UK. And if you bear in mind that this is law, that means companies are not just going to say, oh yeah, we did something. They are going to have to prove that they have a control system, which means fully documenting it if you haven't already. They're going to have to document the audit evaluation process that the company did. And the auditors, who are also abiding by the law, will have to do a very full and thorough audit to show they have checked the controls as well. In other words, this is a massive, expensive, time-consuming task, especially when it first came in, because some companies did not have fully documented control systems and had to start from scratch almost. There's one other thing I would highlight about Sarbanes-Oxley which is different to the UK. It's not something that Sarbanes-Oxley has in it. It's something that Sarbanes-Oxley doesn't have in it. In the UK code, we say chairman should not equal chief executive. Sarbanes-Oxley Act doesn't. Now this is a cultural issue, I suspect. A lot of American companies do have one person as chairman and chief executive. As corporate disaster after corporate disaster continues to happen, there is a fairly strong debate in America at the moment suggesting that maybe this is something that ought to be changed. But for the time being, Sarbanes-Oxley remains, mentioning nothing on it. Several big companies, when it's come around to replacing a chairman and chief executive, have used the opportunity to break the two roles up, but there are still plenty that don't. And that provides us with an example of corporate governance being different in two different countries. Why? Cultural reasons. But then we've also seen an example where the UK requires a unitary single board of directors. Germany requires a two-tier board. Again, two different countries, two different solutions. The reason for that is a legal reason. The fact that in Germany you are required to put employee representatives on a supervisory board. The world of accounting standards is heading more and more towards every country following one set of international standards. Auditing, the same. Corporate governance seems a little bit different in this respect, in that every country tends to have its own code. And that's something we need to investigate. In order to do that, I'm going to do the rest of this chapter out of order. We'll do the public sector governance stuff last, so we'll come back to that. Family structures coming up soon with insiders. But let's take a look at global standards and then we'll work backwards. I mean, if we can do it with accounting standards and audit standards, why not governance? there are some fairly obvious pluses. If every company on every stock exchange was following the same set of rules, principles, board structures, etc., this would be simplicity and consistency for international investors who would know that wherever they invest, they're getting the same thing. And also for multinational companies who could have the same processes, structures, committees, etc. in every country where they operate. Just think how simple and useful that would be. Make it a lot easier for companies to open up in new countries because they could just replicate the structures they have in their home country somewhere else. That simplicity and consistency would surely encourage investment. And if everybody is following the same set of rules, principles, whatever, it also means that you can get all countries together and say, guys, we're all doing this. Anyone got any thoughts on how to make it better? Everyone is fighting with the same set of procedures. What about the downside? The reason why countries tend to have different governance is one, business culture has developed over many hundreds, in some cases thousands of years, and those cultures are very embedded. It is very hard to change embedded cultures. They're stuck there. People don't like change. Different legal systems, as with the Germany situation. Sarbanes-Oxley is for the United States of America, a massive country, complicated economy, developed economy, and that's fine. It's also a country which is used to having lots of lawyers, lots of laws. That's the culture there. You take Sarbanes-Oxley to Madagascar, Papua New Guinea. I doubt Sarbanes-Oxley is going to work. It's just too big and unwieldy, and in such places they're not used to such stuff. It's over the top. So as a result, the current situation is that most countries do their own thing. A lot of governance is pretty similar, country by country, but most countries tend to do their own thing. However, trying to work out what word to put in there. They're not global governance rules, principles even. Generally, guidelines is about right. There is an organisation called the OECD, the Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development. This was originally set up, I think I'm right in saying, by 29 governments from major nations to share best practice and discuss issues that affect all of those countries. For reasons that you will see in class number 5 next week, at this point I want to label the OECD as an example of a supranational public sector body. I'll say no more about that until the next class. And the OECD has tried to put a global governance code together. Because of all the differences, law, culture, etc. already mentioned, they can't do anything that detailed. So all they've managed to do is publish some guiding principles of good governance, designed to act as a starting point for a country looking to develop its own corporate governance code, or I suppose a talking point for countries looking to update their existing codes. There is another organisation called the International Corporate Governance Network, ICGN. These are in the notes at the back of chapter 6. It's the sort of stuff that there's no point me just reading out at you. I want to add something for you. This is a network which might give a clue as to how it sort of works. This is aimed at companies rather than governments like the OECD, institutional investors, academics, to discuss emerging corporate governance issues and give advice to anyone involved in the world of governance. If you want to improve your understanding of corporate governance, get a feel for what current issues are, you certainly don't need to do this. But if you wanted to, a little visit to the ICGN website would make a lot of sense. I think it's icgn.org, but if you just Google it, you'll find it pretty soon. And just go and take a look at what the headlines on that website are. What sort of things are they looking at the moment? It will all help your background understanding and therefore help you understand better the stuff that's actually on the syllabus. Hooray! Now, we're not going to quite finish chapter 6 today. I'm going to leave the public-private sector stuff till next time. But since we've got a couple of minutes left, let's finish by looking at insider versus outsider approaches to governance. Okay, we want organisations to be run in the best interests of shareholders and any other stakeholders we think are important. Fine. How is the best way of making sure shareholder and other stakeholder claims, desires, needs, demands are being met by the board? The insider approach says you put the actual stakeholders on the board, because that will guarantee they are represented. So, major shareholders, potentially consumer groups representing customers, regulators representing the government. What else could you have? Employee representatives, as with Germany. And if all stakeholder groups are represented, then they all get to have their say. Their claims will be heard. But there are potential problems with doing this. Where there are lots of stakeholders, it's going to be hard to include them all. And also, the more stakeholders you put in the room, they're going to conflict. And that may slow or even stop decisions ever getting made. Is there another way of doing this? The outsider approach takes a different route. It says another way of being fair to make sure all stakeholders have a voice is not to put all of them on the board. It's to put no stakeholders on the board. But how will stakeholder views be assessed, I hear you say? The way you get stakeholder representation is instead of them, you put independent NEDs on the board. Who must represent all current stakeholder views. Now they're going to have to decide which stakeholder views are more important, because where there is conflict, either someone wins or someone loses, or some sort of negotiated compromise is going to have to be found. So instead of having the insiders, the stakeholders on the board, you put independent people and tell them to consider stakeholders. There will still be a conflict, but now it goes on inside the heads of the non-executives. And it also means that as stakeholder groups change, the non-executives can change their balance. You see, one of the problems with the blue stuff above me here is that those stakeholders who are represented do not want any other stakeholders getting into that room, because then their power is reduced by these new stakeholder groups. Once you've got power, you tend to cling to it and don't want to cede any of it to anybody else. By having independent non-executives, that problem should be eliminated. Because if the independent NEDs have no stake in this at all themselves personally, why wouldn't they consider all the stakeholders? There is a flip side to this. Stakeholders care because they own a stake. So we're going to have to get some very professional people to be independent NEDs to make sure they care enough even though they have no stake in the company. But that is insider versus outsider. It leads nicely into where we will take the class in week number 5. But for now, that is the end of class number 5. We are virtually at the end of governance, which means now we can look at a question, and also means that we've got a mentoring session tomorrow at 5:15. Hopefully I'll see you there. We'll take a little look at an exam question during that to see the approach for the learning that you've had so far. Do, if you can, go and look at the ICGN webpage to get a little feel for what's going on, and do go research some of these business stories I'm telling you. The BBC swapping from a 2-tier board to unitary. That does not happen very often. While it's fresh and there's lots of articles on the internet, go Google it. But for now, thank you very much. That is the end of class number 4. I will see you for mentoring tomorrow and for class number 5 next week. Thank you and good night.